A decade ago, in the perpetually fog-drenched town of Elowen Creek, a teenage girl named Lena Morell vanished without a trace. Her body was discovered weeks later in the dried riverbed on the outskirts of town, naked except for her shoes, one of which was several sizes too big for her. 2 days before her body was found, someone had carved strange symbols into 2 trees near where she was discovered. Despite extensive searches, no trace of the killer or killers could be found, and the case went cold. Now, a decade later, another girl has been found dead in the same location, and Detective Callum Ridge is called out of a self-imposed retirement to find out what happened. It's me, and this is another creepy pasta I didn't write, so let's begin. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks that lined Ridge Road, their gnarled limbs clawing at the fog, as if trying to drag it down into the forest. Detective Callum Ridge pulled his collar tighter around his neck, burying his chin deeper into his threadbare coat. He hated coming to Elowen Creek. It brought back too many memories, but Chief Inspector Moran wouldn't take no for an answer. It had been almost exactly 10 years since he'd investigated the murder of Lena Morell here, a case that had shaken the small town to its foundations and left scars that ran deeper than the fresh grave in the churchyard. Now, just as suddenly as Lena had vanished all those years ago, another girl, 17-year-old Iris, had disappeared, leaving behind only a half-finished homework assignment and a backpack filled with rocks, just like Lena. Iris's body was found in the dried riverbed on the outskirts of town, naked save for her shoes, one of which was several sizes too large for her. A set of strange symbols had also been carved into the trees nearby, identical to the ones from Lena's case. Somehow it was even more unnerving knowing that a second girl had turned up dead in the same place after all these years. And the fact that the modus operandi seemed identical suggested that the killer or killers were still at large. As Callum rounded the final bend in the road, the imposing silhouette of the White Hart Hotel loomed out of the mist like some kind of malevolent spirit guarding the town. Memories flooded back as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. It was the last place he'd seen Lena alive. She'd been drinking with a group of friends, laughing, carefree, completely unaware that someone had been watching her from the shadows. Callum barely registered the concerned glances and hushed whispers as he made his way to the bar. The locals hadn't been happy about him returning to Elowen Creek, and he could feel their animosity like a physical presence in the room. Everyone here was a suspect. Everyone was hiding something. That much had become clear during his investigation 10 years ago. Still, he needed information, so he did his best to ignore the daggers being thrown his way and asked for a whiskey. As the amber liquid hit his throat, the bartender leaned in conspiratorially and said, "You won't find anything here. You know, the case is closed. We all know what happened to Lena. She took her own life. End of story." Callum knew better than to press the man further. In this town, people believed what they wanted to believe. They didn't want to remember Lena's death, let alone talk about it. And who could blame them? Losing a child was bad enough, but losing 2 children to the same fate, well, that was beyond anyone's comprehension. He left the White Hart without getting any closer to the truth, just as he had all those years ago. As he walked away, he heard a voice call out, "Hey, Ridge, you ever going to tell us what you found out?" He turned to see the woman speaking. She was pretty, even after all these years, with long flowing hair and eyes that never quite seemed to smile. It was like there was a wall around her heart, keeping everyone out. He remembered now. This was Iris's mother. Her husband, Thomas, had taken his own life a few months after Iris's disappearance, unable to bear the grief. "Not now," he said gruffly, not wanting to discuss the case in public, but she only smiled sadly and shook her head. "You never did you?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. "We can't let go until we know the truth." He understood her pain all too well. His sister had been murdered, and her killer had never been caught. He had dedicated his life to making sure that no one else suffered the same fate. But sometimes, like in this case, even he had to admit defeat. That night, he stayed in the Bramblewood Inn, the windows barred from the inside. He couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being watched, as though every rustle in the trees outside his window was the sound of unseen eyes following him, judging him. He tossed and turned in bed, haunted by the ghosts of the past. He could still hear Lena's laughter echoing in the halls of the White Hart, see Iris's backpack lying abandoned on the floor of her bedroom. At first, the locals had tried to hide their fear, brushing aside his questions with tight smiles and evasive answers. But as the days passed and he continued asking questions, Their facades began to crumble, revealing the paranoia that lay beneath. Callum sensed that there was more to Elowen Creek than met the eye, a darkness that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He visited the Bellwether family home, a grand but crumbling manor that looked as though it had seen better days. Iris's father, Thomas, had taken his own life soon after his daughter disappeared, leaving behind a note that simply said, "I'm sorry." He learned Iris had been a bright, bubbly girl who loved nothing more than riding her horse, Blaze, through the misty moors that surrounded the town. The locals told him she was a dreamer, always off in some other world, which made her an easy target. But he wasn't so sure. Maybe she had been naive, but she was also brave, kind and fiercely independent. He spent hours poring over old case files, looking for clues he might have missed all those years ago. He revisited the crime scene, the place where Lena's body had been found, the so-called murder spot. Nothing had changed here. The twisted trees still stood guard over the dried riverbed, silent witnesses to the tragedy that had unfolded here a decade ago. As he walked among the gnarled branches, he felt a sudden sense of dread wash over him. Was he crazy, or was there something actually evil lurking in these woods? He found a small piece of fabric snagged on a tree root. He carefully peeled it away, revealing a faded floral print that was identical to the dress Iris had been wearing the day she disappeared. Had she been brought here, stripped, and then left to die? Or had she done this to herself? He couldn't be sure, but the thought of her being so close sent a shiver down his spine. Suddenly, he heard a noise in the underbrush, a rustle, a snap, and his heart lurched. He spun around, his senses on high alert. Was he being stalked? Was he in danger? Then he saw it, a rabbit, its white tail flashing as it darted away. Relief washed over him, followed by a surge of anger. How could he have been so careless? How could he have been scared by a rabbit? Then he heard a voice behind him say, "Looking for something, detective." He turned to see a tall, thin man with sharp features and eyes that glinted like chips of ice. "Who are you?" the man asked, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Just someone who knows a little more than I should," Callum replied, his voice low and dangerous, "and I suggest you keep it that way." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Callum's face. "I think I will." And with that, he melted back into the trees. Callum knew he was being watched. He could feel it in his bones. Someone, perhaps the same person he had just seen, was following him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He hurried back to his car, his foot heavy on the accelerator, as he tore down the winding country roads. He dared not look back. He didn't want to give his pursuer the satisfaction. When he finally reached the safety of his hotel room, he locked the door and bolted it. He could still feel the eyes boring into him from the other side. He checked under the bed, behind the curtains, in the closet, but there was nothing there, only his own reflection staring back at him accusingly from the full-length mirror. He was being hunted, but by what, and why? As the days passed, Callum grew increasingly desperate. He was no closer to solving the case than he had been when he arrived in Elowen Creek. The townspeople avoided him, whispering behind cupped hands and darting out of his way. He was an outsider here, an unwelcome guest who was dredging up the town's darkest secrets. But then a breakthrough came in the most unexpected of ways. A young girl he had questioned about Iris's disappearance mentioned a name, the same name that had been carved into the trees near where Lena and Iris had been found. Hazel Creed, an outcast who lived on the edge of town, had been seen acting suspiciously around the time both girls had vanished. According to the locals, Hazel had been different ever since she returned from living abroad 5 years ago. She kept to herself, rarely speaking to anyone, and had even sold her house, moving into the isolated crow's nest cottage deep in the woods. Callum found her cottage easily enough, but when he knocked on the door, no one answered. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He stepped inside and called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" There was no reply. He found a single bedroom, a kitchen, and a living room dominated by a large stone fireplace. On the mantelpiece above it sat an old wooden box, adorned with arcane symbols that seemed to writhe and twist before his eyes. What was this place? What secrets did it hold? Driven by an insatiable curiosity, Callum lifted the lid of the box and was immediately overcome by a pungent, earthy smell. Inside lay a collection of strange objects, animal bones, dried herbs and flowers, and a small leather-bound journal. He carefully opened the journal and began to read, his heart pounding in his chest. The diary entries were written in a spidery script that was almost impossible to decipher. But as he read on, he realized that the writer was Hazel Creed, and that she had been using the diary to document her descent into madness. She wrote of strange rituals she was performing to summon an ancient spirit, a being of immense power that dwelt in the mist-shrouded moors surrounding Elowen Creek. The spirit was known as the Grey Man, and it promised her untold power if she would only serve it. Hazel had been driven to this by a desire for revenge against the town that had shunned her, twisted by grief into a terrifying parody of her former self. With each passing day, she had become more erratic, more unhinged, until finally she had crossed the line into full-blown insanity, and then it all made sense. Hazel had lured Lena and Iris into the woods, stripped them naked and carved the symbols into the trees as an offering to the Grey Man. The spirit had possessed the girls, using their bodies as vessels for its own evil. Lena had been driven to kill herself, and Iris had been left to wander the earth as a lost soul. Callum stumbled out of the cottage, his mind reeling. The Grey Man was real, or at least Hazel Creed had believed it to be. But the question still remained. Where was Hazel now? And what had happened to the girls? He knew only one way to find out the truth. He had to journey into the mist-shrouded moors and confront the Grey Man himself. But was he truly ready for what he might find? The wind whipped around him, carrying with it the scent of decay and the sound of unseen things moving in the darkness. The moors were a treacherous place, a labyrinth of bog and bracken, where the mists could swallow you whole, and the spirits of the dead lingered close to the surface. But Callum pressed on, driven by a need for answers that burned like a beacon in the darkness. Suddenly, the mist parted, revealing a clearing in the gloom, and there in the center of the clearing stood a towering oak, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky like the arms of some giant beast. And beneath the oak was a stone monolith inscribed with the same arcane symbols that had adorned the box in Hazel's cottage. As he approached the monolith, Callum felt a cold hand grip his heart, and a voice, dry as autumn leaves, whispered in his ear, "Welcome, detective, to my domain." He spun around, his eyes searching the gloom, but there was nothing there, only the wind sighing through the trees and the distant cry of a lonely. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer to the monolith and placed his hand on its rough surface. And then he saw it, a faint shimmer in the air, like heat haze rising from a summer road. It was a portal, a gateway to another realm, and from it he could feel the presence of the Grey Man, ancient and evil, watching him, waiting for him to cross the threshold. What would he find on the other side? Would he find Lena and Iris? What had become of Hazel? These questions burned in his mind, urging him forward. Callum hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the shimmering light, and with that, he vanished from sight, leaving the mist-shrouded moors of Elowen Creek to its ancient mysteries and the haunting echo of the Grey Man's laughter.